one. If you know, this is a funny comment, the white Gordon Chang. If you know who Gordon Chang is, that's basically who Peter Zeihan is. He pushes the same kind of narrative, constantly claiming that China is going to collapse. In 2001, Gordon Chang wrote a book called The Coming Collapse of China, saying the Chinese miracle is over. China's destined to just fall apart politically, economically, in every way. Didn't happen, obviously. China's continued their growth. They're now the second largest economy on earth, and they've accomplished the incredible feat of actually abolishing relative poverty. But what do you know? Political analyst Gordon Chang is still going on Fox News and saying, post pandemic, China's economy is in a dire situation. So for 20, and this is published in just 2 days ago in 2023. So for the last 23 years, this dude's been predicting the collapse of China as China has continued to grow and advance technologically. And as none of these guys' predictions come true, they're continually given spots on Fox News, hosted by corporate media who ask them about their analysis of China, when these people should be discredited because their predictions have proven false time and time again.
And it's, not only has it not collapsed, but it's been on a steady upward turn, a steady growth. And that includes the periods where the whole global capitalist economy went into crisis. In 2008, China was one of the few places that continued growing, and where their people weren't affected as it were in the U.S., where many middle class families lost their status, and it accelerated the process that we've been calling at the Institute, following the lead of Noah Krashevik, proletarianization. And then with recent crisis that came about with the COVID pandemic, China was one of the few places in the world where not only was it able to put people's lives first, but it still was able to sustain growth, whereas the West was trying to figure out how do we keep profits instead of ensure the safety of people's lives. And not only did it lose a whole ton of more lives than China did, but it also failed to grow. It actually, the economy shrunk in that period. So it's been, you can't look at China and then look at the Western imperialist powers over the last 2 decades and say that socialism fails every time or something, or that socialism is a worse economic system than capitalism, because it's proven in every instance that it is incredibly superior by every single metric you can look at.
The video just started playing there ahead of time. But yeah, I couldn't agree more. And we can go into detail about that as we break this down. We're going to take a look at today Zeihan's appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience. This is what Peter Zeihan looks like for the uninitiated, those who don't know. But before that, I just want to tell you a little bit about this guy's history. So Zeihan predicted in 2005 and 2010 that China was going to collapse within the next 10 years. So similar to Gordon Chang, he's been making this claim that China's destined for collapse for the last 15 years, and he's still making that claim. He's still out here brashly, confidently predicting the collapse of China, despite being so horrendously and obviously wrong repeatedly in the past. That article, or in 2010 article published in Business Insider, Zeihan said, by the end of the decade, it will be pretty obvious to everyone that the China miracle is over. Well, after the next 10 years, China has only increased their economy. They've only shown to be more of an industrial superpower. And as we said earlier, they've accomplished the feats of abolishing relative poverty and becoming the second most powerful economy in the world, after only 70 years ago being an agricultural, feudal, very, very quote unquote backwards economy. In 2005, when Zeihan was working for this sort of think tank type organization called Stratfor, that I'll talk more about in a second, he said China will suffer a meltdown like Japan, and as well as East and Southeast Asia before it. The staggering proportion of bad debt, enormous even in relation to official dollar reserves, represents a defining crisis for China, which of course not only has proven wrong because China hasn't collapsed because of their debt, but they were one of the reasons that the Western economies were even able to survive the 2008 financial crisis. And China, 3 years after Zeihan predicted their collapse due to their failing economy. They were the only economy in the entire world to continue growing during the 2008 financial crisis. So the opposite of what Zeihan predicted was going to happen is what actually happened. So a little bit about Zeihan's history that'll help you understand better where he's coming from, where his perspective is, and where the money that backs him is coming from. He spent 12 years working for Stratfor, which is an American intelligence publishing company, who perform intelligence gathering and advisory services centering on geopolitics for wonderful companies like Lockheed Martin, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, Coca-Cola, Dow Chemical Company. So these are the kind of people that Zeihan was advising, and he eventually became the vice president of Stratfor, this intelligence gathering company. Some leaked emails in 2011 showed that Stratfor was getting information directly from the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. So they're basically a private CIA cutout, similar to the NED, but maybe on a much smaller scale. Barron's weekly paper, or Barron's, which is a weekly paper, once called them the shadow CIA. And they raised millions and millions of dollars through private investors. They just constantly have money pumped into them. So since then, Zeihan has left Stratfor, and he started his own sort of consulting and intelligence gathering company. So I'm not sure where his claims, his predictions about China are coming from. I think it might just be a grift. I think he might just be saying things that are shocking because he knows how many views he can get on YouTube. There are a lot of YouTubers who are doing this now, like putting these really clickbaity titles about the coming collapse of China and how China's economy is imploding. So it could just be a grift, or you'll see this more as we get into the video, or he's trying to convince companies to stop investing in China because there's still so many companies who are investing capital in China because they're making money off of it. And Zeihan is trying to discourage them from doing that and trying to encourage capital flight from China as a way to weaken their economy. And that'll, I can get more into that argument as we go here. But yeah, anything to say before we start the video, Carlos?
I mean, maybe I could save this analysis until after the video, but I think you've done a good job at presenting the background that shows the material interests that are driving his ideological positions. And it's fair to say that, perhaps all of this is being pulled out of, the place where the sun doesn't hit him. But even if it's not, I think it's telling of the mode of analysis, because maybe he's just saying, well, if everything continues the way that it is, and everything stays in China static, this is going to happen in 10 years. And that is archetypical of the bourgeois outlook, of the way that, bourgeois thinkers approach the world, where they think that everything is the way that it is and that transformations don't occur. And what happens when you have a country that's led by a communist party that's conscious of its historical role is that even if it sees a crisis coming, it's able to avert it because its interests are not dictated by the market and capitalist profits, but by the interests of the people. And so even if you can get to such a position where it could be predicted that if China continues going the way that it's going, in 10 years it's going to crash, the Communist Party would never allow that to happen. And it's shown historically that it won't. Again, the case of 2008 and the global financial crisis, and also the case of the COVID pandemic. Like, every prediction that they made was, oh, China's going to crash. And then China is able to, maneuver and do things necessary so that its people don't end up getting hit hard, even if it cuts into profits and the interests of the markets. That's something that the West cannot do, or doesn't allow itself to do, because capital is in command.
And that's what you're going to see. I mean, what his argument fits exactly with what you predicted there. He's going to show snapshots of China's population and try to imply that shows inevitable collapse. And, you even hear Joe Rogan, I've heard him say this since then, how crazy is it that China didn't see these demographic problems happening? How crazy is that they didn't predict this? It's like, it is crazy because they did predict it. China's very aware of their changing demographics and their population, and, they'll adjust their economy. Yeah, we can get into it right now then.
The Joe Rogan Experience.
The rich world was a population column from 1945 to 1992. And with the end of the Cold War, the developing world became a column in 1992 until now. The problem is that this is all temporary, because birth rate keeps dropping, people keep living older, and your column eventually inverts into an open pyramid, upside down. And now you no longer have children, you no longer have a replacement generation at all. And there aren't enough people in their 20s and 30s to buy everything. And there aren't enough people in their 40s and 50s to pay for the retirees. So this decade was always going to be the decade that most of the advanced world moves into mass retirement and the economic model collapses.
There are, demographic issues, and we're seeing this in, a lot of different countries. But I also think this is just another form of Malthusianism. He's drawing a connection between industry and commerce with population size or with demographics without ever actually showing a proof of correlation, without ever showing that size of population is materially correlated to how much exchange or how much production is going on in this economy. So it's a different form of Malthusianism than, Robert Thomas Malthus in the 1800s saying that the famine in India was caused by the growth of their population. But it's a similar type of thing where you try and connect the population of a country to their economy, and he'll never actually draw a material correlation. He'll never actually show how, the changing population affects the economy. But he'll use that, he'll try and state that there is a correlation there.
And it sounds really good for a lot of people because you hear the words population and you're like, wow, that's a concrete analysis. They're talking about the whole, all the people, etc. And that's something that Marx debunks in his process of working out his critique of capitalist political economy at the beginning of the Grundrisse, where he says that these analyses that start with population and try to make these connections are all based on false concreteness. They don't actually have the concrete. What they have is what he called an imagined concrete. And ultimately, it's really just an idealist projection onto the world that's not grounded on an actual concrete analysis of the conditions in China.
Exactly. Someone says, so are all of his stories just fake? Some of his data points are off and questionable and have been critiqued, but a lot of times what he's doing is what Carlos said, taking a data point, taking a snapshot in isolation, and trying to draw the conclusion from that it means inevitable collapse. And here, what we're trying to point out is that he's tying population to how the economy is doing and demographic numbers to how the economy is doing when those things aren't necessarily correlated, and he'll never prove that they're correlated.
And next decade was always going to be the decade that happened to the developing world. And we find out recently that the Chinese have jumped the ship, and this is their last decade too. So all of the globalized connections and consumptions that create the world we know, we are at the end of it. And we have.
So it's also a cope for the American economy that's deindustrializing and declining. Oh, it's not because of capitalism and outsourcing and financialization. It's all because of changing demographics, and next it'll happen to China. Spoiler alert, in 10 years, everything he said will seem ridiculous because it's not going to happen unless there's some kind of external regime change in China.
And I don't know if Zeihan is critical of like the state of things in the West, but that seems to be a constant go-to for people that even want to be critical about the establishment. Because I just saw a video of Tucker Carlson recently, where in order to compare the very visible cognitive decline of Joe Biden and how the media just ignores it, he references like the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And how when one of the Kims, I can't remember which one, got a big tumor on the back of his neck, the media all ignored it. It's like, well, that's not true. That's not even remotely true. But it's interesting how always, in order to critique the established order of the West, and unfortunately, Jimmy Dore is someone who does this as well with the case of censorship, they always then have to reference the boogeyman of communism. And then their reference point for how bad capitalist imperialism is getting is always some caricature, projection, and false image of what communism supposedly did or does.
So true. And I see the virtual Jonathan catching on already. He's trying to make a self-fulfilling prophecy, create a scare so there's less investment. It's transparent. I agree. I think partially he's a grifter and he's trying to say things that have shock value and that will pick up traction for him on the internet. But I also think, and this is based on his position as a corporate consultant and intelligence gatherer and geopolitical analyst who informs corporations and consults corporations. I think he's trying to encourage capital flight from China in order to weaken the Chinese economy. And like you said, this self-fulfilling prophecy of China collapsing will finally come true for him, which isn't going to happen because China's an $18 trillion economy and the second largest economy in the world. And corporations aren't just going to leave because the Central Intelligence Agency is telling them to, because they dislike China's politics. But
have to go back to a world where trade is more focused on the countries that have a better demographic and security infrastructure, because the Americans are no longer patrolling the global oceans anymore. So we're losing the security.
America's no longer patrolling the global oceans. We're losing our security. Let's put more military in the South China Sea, right? That's a good idea, right? Look how big, bad, and evil China is. Their economy keeps growing. We need a larger military presence in their waters.
And this is the problem with sophism and this form of rhetorical approaches, where your arguments could be completely substanceless, like not grounded in facts, not grounded in logical deductions and rational deductions. But if the way that you express them sounds eloquent, the vast majority of people will sit there and be like, "Damn, that makes sense." And what's sad is that you can get someone arguing a completely different thing on Joe Rogan's podcast, and Joe Rogan will be like, "Oh, damn, that makes sense." But then you bring, this the sophist on, and because of those devices and the form through which he speaks, he'll end up convincing Joe. And I'm sure Joe's a few times in this podcast, even though I haven't seen it, I've only seen bits of it. He'll be like, "Oh wow, that makes sense," or he'll engage with these substanceless arguments.
Yep. He provides very little pushback. He has some good questions, but mostly just like, wow, yeesh.
Ramifications of an open system. At the same time, we're losing the demographic capacity to support it in the first place. And that's all going down right now.
So when you're saying that China has 10 years to go,
at most,
what do you mean by that?
Well,
and you can tell Joe sees how ridiculous this is at points too, which is funny.
Well, we now know that they've lied about their population statistics, and they overcounted their population by over 100 million people, all of whom would have been born since the one-child policy was adopted. So this is one of those places where they've got more people in their 60s and their 50s and their 40s and their 30s and their 20s.
Now, what was the logic behind the one child? Was it that they were overpopulating?
Mao was concerned that as the country was modernizing, the birth rate wasn't dropping fast enough, and that the young generation was literally going to eat the country alive. So they went through
this is unrelated, but I heard recently that the one-child policy might have been pushed on China by the West. Do you know anything about that, Carlos?
I do not. My guess would be that the forces of production hadn't developed to a point where they could have allowed just massive population growth and have.
That's always been my understanding, but
right, and that would, if that is the case, and maybe it's not, but that would imply that with the development that China has had and the immense opportunities that young people have in China, that all the incentives would be there for the population to develop and for young people to have kids in ways in which they're just not in the U.S. Like, I'm told a few times that I'm crazy for having a kid at my age in the U.S. because there's literally barely any opportunities, but in China is a complete opposite. So I mean, from that standpoint, that assumes that the practices of generations past in terms of birth rates and it assumes that it's going to continue the same, and it misses the point that life in China changes sometimes by the year. Like, you go to one province and you revisit it 5 years after, and it's a completely different province, right? In ways in which we just don't understand in the West. And I have friends over there, and I've followed many people who vlog over there, and they'll return to a place that they visited 2 years ago, and it's like if it's not the same place. And
crazy.
these changes,
Shenzhen, dude, Daniel Dumbrill. Every week there's something new.
Exactly. And so these changes reflect themselves in the individuals and in the choices that, in the elements that constitute important factors in making the choice of whether they want to have a kid or not. And their choice usually is going to end up leading them to understanding that if they have a kid, they're going to have tremendous opportunities as parents and for their kids in a country that's developing and flourishing, as opposed to what we're doing in the US. It's the complete opposite.
Yep.
Breakneck urbanization program, which destroyed the birth rate. At the same time, they penalized anyone who wanted to have kids. And both of those at the same time have generated the demographic collapse we're in now.
And the problem with that also was that they wanted male.
Notice how he never describes what the demographic collapse is or how it will affect China's process of industrialization or whatever. It's just what some people have called macroeconomic hand waving, right? Saying demographic collapse, right? That sounds nice. It sounds intelligent, but he never says what he means by that.
Children.
Yeah, there's a cultural aspect to that too. And obviously men can't have kids on their own.
And what is the like ratio to men to women in the younger people in
Can
China?
we pause that real quick? Because what's implicit in that is like the Asiatic patriarchalism and anti-woman sexist sentiments, and that is bullshit. That is destroyed as soon as the communists, not fully destroyed, it still has to be combated, but it's institutionally destroyed as soon as the communists grab power. And the people that wanted to propel those similar patriarchal and sexist forms of life are the people that these folks endorse. What's that dance that's been going around at the theatrical?
Oh,
the-
Shen Yu, is that what it's called?
I don't remember what it's called, but all of those interests that are anti-China and anti the People's Republic that represent the old order, where there was sexism and where there was a strong patriarchy, that all gets removed with, not fully, but it's combated at the state level institutionally with the communists. And that's across the board. The same thing happens in the Soviet Union and Cuba and in every socialist country, because whereas capitalism cannot survive without racism, without sexism, socialism cannot survive with it. It has to continuously fight against these poisonous forms of false consciousness, which sever the people from each other, which divide the people instead of uniting them.
For sure. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we get into the Lacerdo piece later.
Before the data revision, with the last set of lies, it was about 1 to 1.2. It was the most distorted in the world, even more than Sri Lanka, where there had been a civil war for 30 years. Since then, we don't have good sex-by-sex data, but it's undoubtedly worse.
And so what are the other problems that they're encountering that leads you to believe that they only have 10 years left?
Well, without young people, we've seen their labor costs increase by a factor of 14 since the year 2000. So
labor costs have been increased. Labor costs from the perspective of the bourgeoisie, from the perspective of multinational capitalists, who this guy is an analyst on behalf of, labor costs. What is another word for labor costs? Wages. Oh no, so Chinese wages have increased 14 times? No, clearly their society is collapsing.
Right, and that's Marx makes this point in I believe is the second German edition to the first volume of Capital, where he's like, because of the class interests of the bourgeoisie, their ideologues just cannot understand the world anymore. And maybe at one point when the bourgeoisie was still a somewhat revolutionary class, you can have your Smiths and your Ricardos that they can attempt as to the best of their ability to reproduce the concrete concretely. That means to actually have a view in their thought of the existing order that corresponds to reality. They can't do that anymore. There's so many biases entrenched to the fact that they attach their interest to the existing order that prevents them from understanding the world as it actually is. And that's what he's doing here. Occam's razors would say, 14 times the 14 time increase of the labor costs. What could that be? Wage increases, the fact that Chinese living standards are just rocketing upwards. No, it can't be that. It has to be all these different factors. And okay, my conclusion is going to be that the population is getting older, and so older people need more things and more costs. And it's BS, but it's what they have to do in order to have whatever semblance of empirical analysis that they're making match up to the predisposed conclusions that they need the empirical data to imply.
Right. When you hear him talk about the empirical data, he's not even close to exact, right? His only thing is that China's lying about the numbers, and the demographics have surely gotten worse. That's all he gives us. So he doesn't even have precise data points or concrete data points that you would use in, say, a dialectical materialist analysis of China, like we're going to show later in the show with Domenico Lacerdo. But yeah, that's what they have to do, is just extrapolate from data or smudged data to try and draw these broad conclusions about the inevitable collapse of the U.S.'s enemies.
Mexican labor is now 1/3 the cost of Chinese labor. Their educational system focuses on memorization over skills. So despite a trillion.
So that is just absurdly wrong, scary wrong. And if you want to know how wrong that is, I listened to this podcast with this completely apolitical guy, Jeffrey Townsend, who is involved in the technology sector and is a professor in China. And he says, straight up, like if you take 100 college students from China and then 100 from the U.S., the Chinese college students are going to run circles around them every single time. And not only that, but they're Zeihan says they're based on memorizational learning rather than skill development. That is so far from the truth. In Chinese elementary schools and middle schools, they're already exposing the kids to industrial work, having them do like what we would call tech ed classes here in the US, heavily focused on skill development. Very different from the US education system, which is based on the factory school system. Basically just training up kids to be good factory workers. But China focuses on heavily on skill development at all stages of education. But higher education specifically, they're making huge breakthroughs in technology and many different fields. So,
And that's a really weird dichotomy because it juxtaposes skill implied in a technical sense to memorization, which is like a form of learning that if you absolutize it, that's where you have problems. But in the US, memorization is absolutized. Like learning consists of remembering as much stuff as you can for the exam. And that's not to say that this process of memorizing things isn't important or plays some elementary role in learning. There's that famous Latin proverb of sorts, repetitio est mater studiorum, which is repetition is the mother of all knowledge. Yeah, to a certain base extent, it is. But in China, you have a mixture of everything. It's one of the only countries in the world where the humanities are booming. The humanities are not really based on just memorizing like what Plato said or something, or what Hemingway said. It's somewhat creative and open, and it's not just in the tech where China has completely boomed, and most of the developments that are coming from tech are in the world are coming from China, but it's also in the humanities in every field of learning. And that's just what you get when you get socialism. You get to emphasize education in a way that's not just to produce robots that can then enter the workforce and be smart enough to do the jobs that they need, but dumb enough to not think critically about why it is that they are doing those jobs and why it is that the existing state of affairs is the way that it is.
for sure.
$1 billion of investment in a bottomless supply of intellectual property theft. They really haven't advanced technologically in the last 15 years.
China hasn't advanced technologically in the last 15 years, he says. Again, if you don't want to trust us, if you think we're biased because we're Marxists, listen to this podcast where Jeffrey Townsend talks about China leading the world in technological advancements, because they absolutely are. I mean, this is pure nonsense, and he's just reliant here on his audience being completely uneducated about what's going on in China. I mean, Carlos just said they're leading the world in technological innovations. They're leading the world in all these fields. So to say that they're collapsing because there's no technological innovation and because of intellectual property theft is hilarious. When the use of intellectual property laws to gain a competitive advantage is rampant in the West, and it's often slows down technological advancement in the West, because corporations will use intellectual property laws to prevent competitors from developing cheaper, newer, better products, and it puts a big fetter on technological advancement and productive advancement in the U.S. So it's pure projection.
Yeah. Absolutely. Development is based on the bottom line in the capitalist West, and that's profit. If you could do something that will benefit a whole bunch of people or just boost technological development, but if it's not very profitable, you don't consider it as one of your options. Profit is the bottom line, the first and only consideration in all of these in all of these areas. But you make a really good point. Like, he's banking on the fact that his audience or the people listening are ignorant of this. And obviously, if it's primarily working people who are listening, in what time are they supposed to like look up the reality of China and listen to 30 different speeches and podcasts and read books and a bunch of articles? Like, that's not very likely. I mean, there's some people like Noah Krashevik who wakes up. One of the directors at our institute wakes up at 5 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning to do that. Comes home from work, does it, and continues to do it. That's not the vast majority of people, and they're banking on the fact that there's a one-dimensional voice, whether it's in big corporate mainstream media or the big podcast, that there's some divergences in some important areas, but whenever the subject of a communist state comes along, there is a complete unidimensional understanding of communism, of China, of Cuba, of the former USSR, and no alternative voices in those areas are ever allowed to enter the discourse, never. And so, how do you fact check that? Like, it's kind of easy for us that we've been doing this for a very long time, but for people that are not used to like doing research, how do you even go about like the process of thinking how you can even fact check that against like contrary claims and contrary evidence that if they see it, it's going to obviously be rooted in facts and not in a house of cards like his arguments are. But how do you go about that process? So it's banking on an ignorance of the people that they love sustaining.
Yes.
Mexican labor is probably about twice as skilled as Chinese labor now, even though it's 1/3 the cost. They've consolidated into an ethnic-based, paranoid, nationalistic cult of personality, and it's very difficult for the Xi administration to even run it because it's not an administration anymore. No one wants to bring Xi information on it.
So how funny is that? China is a total cult of personality dominated by Xi Jinping, but nobody wants to bring Xi Jinping information anymore because he's such an evil dictator. Well, which one is it, Peter? Which one is it? Do the people bow down and worship Xi Jinping every day because of his cult of personality, or are they all terrified of Xi Jinping and they won't bring Xi Jinping any information? And by a paranoid nationalistic people, he means the people who are aware of imperialist aggression, of people who are patriotic, and of people who are dedicated to defending themselves from external attacks. And from the perspective of Peter, a Western imperialist, he hates that. He can't stand that the Chinese people are committed to maintaining their sovereignty, maintaining their independence, and that they're aware of this sort of imperialist aggression and imperialist tactics that are bound to be used against them. So he calls them a nationalistic cult of personality or whatever. But that's just him, again, coping because the Chinese people are aware of what him and his cronies are trying to do in overthrowing their country.
And banking on these myths that have been created relatively recently, as of the last 2 decades, that like China is like an ethno state, that it's mistreats its minorities, and that's overseeing the process of a Uyghur genocide or cultural genocide, and that's just completely false. And when you compare it to the U.S., it's just incredible the hypocrisy. But I recently saw this video from Li Jingjing. If you don't know of her channel, please go check it out. It's phenomenal. But he talks. She has an expert on who talks about like how you have different currencies, different languages within the currency, which is something that like we don't have in the U.S. Even though we have like the portion of the population that doesn't speak that speaks other languages from English is a lot larger than what it is in China.
Souvenir from China. Chinese currency. But if you look at here in the script, you have both Chinese, English, and Arabic characters, which is the language of the Uyghurs. And China put it on its national currency. This never happened in Europe or the United States. To have not the national language, but a minority language on your national currency. I have a souvenir.
Yes, that shows the Han nationalism of the Chinese government. And I mean, there's so many examples like that. Like Uyghur people were exempted from the one-child policy for cultural and religious reasons. They've been given their own autonomous zone to practice their culture. So
It's the most
definitely
mosque.
Sorry, go ahead.
It's the most mosque dense area. I think in the whole world, or in the whole like non-Arab part of the world.
Anything. So, like Putin lied to his face, for example, last February about the wars. You know, why would I invade Ukraine? And you can see in some of the presses, the defense guys in the back of the room, like, I didn't want to say anything because he has a history of shooting people he doesn't like. And so the Chinese were the only country that was caught with their.
It's like he's a cartoon villain, like a mob boss. It's like he expects Americans to think that action movies are how the world really works. If anyone disobeys Xi, just grabs a pistol and like shoots them in the head, or pulls a lever and they fall into like a vat of crocodiles, you know, if you disobey the regime.
That's why the movies are there, and that's why the shows are there, and that's why the media is there, and it's all interconnected. Like they can only bank on like people believing this because there's a whole background of cultural apparatuses that have conditioned people to believe this. Without that background that gets institutional financial support, and that's, you know, it's gets billions and billions and billions of dollars pumped into it in order to make people believe these things. Without that background, no one would have the confidence to go on a show like that and say such stupid things.
Mm-hmm.
Pants down when this all went down. The Biden administration is basically taking the trade policy of Donald Trump and running it through a grammar checker and putting it into institutions. So we now have tech barricades that prevent the Chinese from buying the equipment, the tools, or the software that's necessary to make semiconductors. In fact, he went so far as to say any Americans working in the sector have to either quit or give up their American citizenship. Every single one of them either quit or was transferred abroad within 24 hours. So the tech system is stalled. They don't have the young people to go consumption-led. They're completely dependent on the U.S. Navy to access international trade. They are the most vulnerable country in the world right now. And based on how things go with Russia, we're looking at a significant amount of raw materials falling off the map, specifically food and energy. And the Chinese are the world's largest importer of both of those things. So there's no version of this where China comes through looking good. And the challenge for
It was basically just a threat to sanction China when he says they're dependent on the U.S. Navy. And when he says they're semiconductor, you know, they're not able to produce semiconductors. Taiwan's the biggest semiconductor producer in the world by a lot. And, you know, Taiwan is a part of China, but of course not in this guy's worldview. In this guy's worldview, Taiwan is independent and, you know, they'll allow themselves to be used as a puppet of the U.S. and, you know, cut China off from semiconductors, which of course Taiwan has said they're not going to do. And in response, recently a few U.S. politicians have floated the idea of destroying whatever the name of the semiconductor facility is in Taiwan, which is just an insane, aggressive threat towards a country for producing semiconductors and not doing what we want. But.
And Quarter here gets the irony right. They're completely dependent on a foreign military that's trying to encircle them from accessing the oceans. Like, what? And for real, to say that they're dependent on the one force that prevents them from doing things that would allow them to thrive a little more is just so completely upside down that, again, like, how someone has the confidence to go on a show where he's going to be seen by millions and say such stupid and baseless things is... It's, again, banking on the fact that people are ignorant about these issues.
TCMC, thank you, Timmy Smith.
For the rest of us is to figure out how do we, in as smooth and quick as a process as possible, figure out how we can get along without them, because they are going away, and they're going away this decade for certain.
Well, if you say they're going away,
Just as I predicted in 2010.
Clearly, they're not just going to lay down. They're
No, they'll
going to try to adjust.
You can tell Joe Rogan realizes how stupid this shit is. Clearly, they're not just gonna lay down. They're just 1.2 billion people are gonna go away. Yes, Joe. Can't you tell? I'm saying it confidently. I'm saying it in an articulate way. That means it's true. Ha 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 ha.
They're
No, they'll
going to
die.
try to adjust.
Yeah, they'll die.
Right? But how so? Do you think this is because, like, what is, other than, well, here would be a big problem, right? Taiwan. Like, if we impose the kind of sanctions that we've imposed on Russia, if China decides to invade Taiwan and the world stands up and the world imposes sanctions on China, how does that?
Ha ha ha. That's funny that ape man Joe Rogan thinks that's how sanctions work. The world stands up and imposes sanctions, even though the whole world is trying to stand against the sanctions on Venezuela, and the UN has called for the US to alleviate them many times. However, the IMF, the World Bank, and their thousands of subsidiary banks are all controlled by Western finance capital. They've all been set up by the West. So the US has unprecedented control over the global financial system, which is something that China has been combating with the Belt and Road Initiative, which is why more and more countries are turning towards trade with Russia and China, which is why the effectiveness of US sanctions has gone down. But it's not, sanctions aren't enforced by the world standing up against evil dictators. They're enforced when the West wants regime change, when the West wants to surround a country and prevent any trade from getting in or out, to starve that country's people and turn them against their government.
Go.
Very ugly for the Chinese. So, say what you will about the Russian economy. It's corrupt, it's inefficient, it's not very high value add, but it's a massive producer and exporter of food and energy. You put the sanctions that are on the Russians on Beijing, and you get
It's funny when they actually say something that's true. The Russian economy is evil. It's bad. It's a morally wrong economy. I don't know how you can make that judgment, but Peter Zeihan has. However, they are producing a lot of energy, and we need to be worried about that.
deindustrialization collapse and a famine that kills 500 million people in under a year. And the Chinese know this. They can only push so hard. Also, you can make the argument that if the Russians succeed, they actually solve or at least address some of their problems. Even if the Chinese were able to capture Taiwan without firing a shot, it doesn't solve anything for them. They're still food importers. They're still dependent on the United States. They're still energy importers. And even if they take every single one of those semiconductor fab facilities intact, they don't know how to operate them because they can't operate their own. And their own are among the worst in the world, not the best.
He's somewhat right in that China can't push too hard against it. They can't push so hard to the point where Western capital pulls out. But like I've been saying, it's an $18 trillion economy, right? Just because intelligence agency talking heads like Peter Zeihan want regime change in China doesn't mean that Western firms are going to stop making millions and millions of dollars in profit in China, because they're making so much off of the consumers in China and the labor in China, which is, partly the point of reform and opening up. Will allow the West to make money here, and then the Western bourgeoisie won't want to destroy us, or at least portions of it won't. And you see that playing out here. Peter Zeihan is trying to encourage all these corporations to pull their investments from China because, they're going to collapse. They're going to collapse. Trust me this time. And Western companies aren't doing it. They're making too much money.
And what are they going to do? Like they pull out and they're going to put these massive skyscrapers on a plane and take it out of the infrastructure is already there. The conditions are so different from what they were in 78, from what required reform and opening up in the first place. And they're even different from the conditions that shaped various changes in Soviet policy. We are entering a multipolar world order. The whole world, with the exception of the 14% of the global population that's in the global north that belong to the former colonial and to the present imperialist powers, the whole world is saying, F this. I don't want to engage in a world where my internal policy is dictated by X, Y, or Z country to make my people poor for the sake of sustaining the American imperialist order. I'm going to trade with China. And the whole world is turning towards that area. So the difficulties which pushed communist countries to see the necessity of opening up are becoming less and less and less and less, to the point where I don't see why not in the foreseeable future an option might be taken up that let's just nationalize all of this shit. And we already have an alternative world that we can continue trading with that's abandoning the imperialist camp. Let's do it. And it's the vast majority of the world this time, not unlike it was during the Soviet Union, that it was still a minority in terms of the whole globe. So, he's talking as if even if capital pulls, yeah, if they pull tomorrow, there might be issues. But the way that China is developing, I mean, there's no stopping their continual growth.
For sure. Unparalleled Dev says Peter Zeihan is secretly 3 multinational corporations standing on each other, occupying an empty suit. I mean, yeah, that's who funds him. Millions of dollars in investment from various companies. Work closely with Lockheed Martin, Goldman Sachs, American Bank. So make sure to send some super chats to Midwestern Marks to combat the $12 million that Peter Zeihan was given by one corporation in 2011 by giving us $2 to $5 or whatever. We'll go a little bit longer with this video. We don't have to watch the whole thing. This man is insufferable.
Yeah, the only reason, in my opinion, to
There's Joe Rogan's pushback. Whew.
be concerned about a Taiwan war is because Xi has so isolated himself that when one person is making all the decisions and that one person refuses to access information to make the decisions, strange stuff happens.
And when you say refuses to access, what do you mean by that?
It's very concrete analysis there, Peter. Strange stuff happens. And there you have it again. Xi Jinping's the dictator. There's a cult of personality. All the Chinese people buy into nationalism and, a country led by Xi Jinping, but also he's isolated and everybody hates him and he can't get any information because everyone hates him so much.
And there's a good point that Roland Bohr makes in one of his articles titled Not So Motherism. He repeats it in his book, Socialism with Chinese Characteristics, A Guide for Foreigners, which is that a lot of these comments are just based on racist, Orientalist assumptions about China.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Everyone in the Orient just believes what the leader believes, what the bad Oriental dictator believes. And it's just complete bullshit. It's just racism. I mean, there's 100 million members in the Chinese Communist parties. Not all of them think the same. They come from different class backgrounds. There's constant contradictions that they have to address, which are not negative, but it's just a facet of everyday social life. Certain contradictions that have to be addressed, and to sit there and act like it's just Xi Jinping calling the shots for a country with 1.2 or 3 billion people. It's just completely absurd. It's grounded on these racist assumptions about China and Chinese people.
Yeah, I remember my brother told me once he had a cultural communications class, and they were talking about how the Chinese have a much more authoritarian culture, whatever that means. And it's just, I'm like, yeah, I got to be careful with that. He's like, why? I'm like, sounds like it's just a racist trope. I mean, you could say America has an authoritarian culture, the way we've followed the leader into these disastrous, murderous wars, or the way that our economy is structured with Wall Street shareholders and bankers at the top. You could say that's a far more authoritarian culture than anything China has, but it's just tropes. And that's also what this guy, Jeff Townsend, says in his podcast about in response to Zeihan, his Joe Rogan appearance, is that a lot of these are just tropes from the 90s, or just straight up racist tropes about Chinese people. Being unskilled and just being so stupid that they just follow their dictator wherever. When in reality, they're very smart, they're strategic, and they know exactly what they're doing, which is angering the crap out of the West, which is why you're getting so much cope and projection from Mr. Zeihan here.
He does not have normal information flows anymore. Like even at the height of the Trump administration, when Trump was basically isolated himself from the entire intelligence community, he was still getting the daily briefing. There was still information being put in front of him. But Xi is so isolated himself. He doesn't want to hear anything except for what he wants to hear. And since no one knows what the status of the conversation with the voices in his head in on any given day, no one wants to bring him anything unless they're ordered to.
How do we know this about him?
because there's no one to listen to anymore. That's one of the fun things about Russia versus China right now, is that the Russian information security is so poor that American intelligence is literally listening in on everything. But in China, we can hear into the office, but there are no conversations happening.
So we know that Xi's not getting information because they prevented American intelligence from spying on them. What the hell is the correlation there? What does that have to do with the price of tea in China?
Oh my God. These people are just so incredibly insufferable. And he mentioned earlier, like, isolation. Like, I'm sure he means Xi from everyone else, but to even use the word isolation in reference to China is absurd. The whole world wants to trade with China. China's basically trading with the whole world. It's helping through win-win international relations. It's helping to create what it's hoping to create, which is a common prosperity for and a shared future for mankind. And um, to conjoin isolation in any way next to the country that is establishing the most relations with countries around the world, that's developing the whole world through these win-win relations, is just absolutely absurd. If anything, it's the U.S. who's isolating itself, who, even Europe, who's been one of these um, uh, an aid to empire, always to American-dominated imperialism. It's the people, at least, are beginning to turn their backs on this order, and it's not unforeseeable that the U.S.'s greatest allies will soon turn on them, because they're on their alliance and their following with the U.S. is making their people's lives a lot worse, to the point of, you have these convulsions in France, for instance, where it's not unseeable that in any moment, the revolutionary situations could arise, and a more profound change could happen in these countries. So Europe is going to have to ask itself, does it want to continue following the U.S., or is it going to prioritize its sort of national security and the capitalism that exists there?
For sure. And I won't torture you guys too much more with Peter Zeihan, but I did want to show people the comments, because I braced myself. I cringed when I went into these comments thinking that it was going to be a bunch of people falling for what Peter Zeihan said. Like Carlos said earlier, it's hard for uneducated people to see through this stuff. But people must be seeing through this stuff, or at least their instincts, the Joe Rogan audience, their instincts were to be questionable of this guy. So look at all these top comments, at least on YouTube. Obviously, Rogan's on Spotify, but the top one here, the only thing I know for certain is that Joe should have this guy back on in a decade and play back the entire interview to see how it compares to what's actually happening in China. Agree. And I think they should have Carlos and I on as well, so that we can compare our predictions about China to those of Peter Zeihan. Analyst, one of the only jobs that doesn't get you in trouble when you're wrong. So this guy calling out Peter Zeihan's previous wrong predictions that didn't come true, that he's never had to apologize for. He's never even had to walk back. Joe Rogan doesn't even say, what about that 2010 Business Insider article you wrote that said China was going to collapse within the next decade? It's a decade later, and you're making the same claim, dog. Peter published an article in 2010 saying China would collapse in the next decade. Fast forward to now, China is still here. Peter basically keeps predicting every decade until either it happens or he dies of old age still predicting. Next comment. I'm sure
And making a ton of money predicting every decade that in the next decade China's going to fall.
Yep. Exactly. Lars Michael says, I'm sure this guy knows a lot and has some good points, but he expresses everything with 100% certainty, and I've never met a competent person that does that. True, but that is how all the neocons operate, isn't it? These intelligence people, folks like John Bolton, it's everything is black and white. These are the bad guys. We're the good guys. Here's what's going down. I can predict the future. Just listen to me. It's what an ideological demagogue does, I guess. It's not what somebody who's trying to make a measured and accurate analysis does. And so this is someone who knows nothing about China, right? But just from Zeihan's arrogance, they can tell that he's not a serious intellectual who's doing serious work here. He's either the greatest bullshitter to ever live or is truly confident in his information. Yeah.
It's definitely the former. But I wonder what role the fact that the American people just don't trust the establishment class. What role has that played in them recognizing how it is that a lot of these people who are super confident about what they say and they make these pompous statements about socialism and whatever form of life exists outside of the Western imperialist status quo. I wonder what role that's played in them sort of generalizing that analysis and just recognizing, oh, when someone's speaking to me in this way, in the same way that the Pete Buttigieg's and the Hillary Clintons and the Obamas do, they're probably telling us some bullshit. Or in the same way that other, mainstream Republican candidates do, they're probably feeding us a load of bullshit through a very confident and rhetorically elegant form.